Good morning, good afternoon, maybe late evening salutations to you, my friends, if you're watching this at 2 in the morning because you just really needed to dive into God's Word. I hope you're doing well. I hope you got everything you wanted on your Christmas list. I hope I got everything I wanted on my Christmas list, but I'm recording this in the past and you're out there just living in the future, at least relative to where I'm at right now. Actually, in the office where I'm recording, there is a thing. This radio, I'm gonna pull it out of the wall. Look at this thing. This is so old, but I looked over and had no clue that this is in the office where I work. This exact radio boombox setup I got for Christmas in 6th grade. Now this is not mine, it just happens to be exactly like mine and it's in the office and I looked over and it was very nostalgic. And here's the crazy thing about this boombox. When I got it, I was so excited because it had this thing at the top. It's a cassette player. It detaches into a little Walkman you can take with you. Oh, it's so vintage right now. And I got it and I loved it, but I couldn't love it because I didn't like my parents and I didn't want them to know that they got me something that I really enjoyed. So I listened to all of my cassette tapes on that boombox, but never let my parents know that I enjoyed it. And here's what's funny about that and all the nostalgia and the feelings I have right now is we are celebrating the Feast of the Holy Family today, and our readings all focus on this question: what do we owe to each other? As far as our families, what do we owe to our moms, to our dads, to our children? If you're married, husbands, what do you owe to your wives? Wives, what do you owe to your husbands? What do these relationships mean and what do they look like? And how do we view them through the lens of the Holy Family, Joseph, Mary, and Jesus? And the first reading this week is kind of a cool one from the book of Sirach. Now, if you have friends who are not Catholic, they don't have this book in their Bibles. Sirach is from the wisdom tradition and what we call the deuterocanonical books, or they might call the apocryphal books. So we get this great reading from the book of Sirach in the wisdom tradition. And it really focuses on practical living. That's what Sirach is. It's a lot of stuff similar to Proverbs. Practical living, what does it mean to live as a good person, a person of faith? And this part talks all about families, and it talks about what we do with our parents, especially as they start to grow old. But it talks about relationships first. So it begins with saying, God sets a father in honor over his children. A mother's authority he confirms over her sons. Whoever honors his father atones for sins and preserves himself from them. When he prays, he is heard. He stores up riches who reveres his mother. So we're starting with God kind of focusing and leaning in this inspired word to one of the commandments: honor your father and your mother. Now, let's pause here because admittedly that can be tough. Sometimes we struggle to honor our mother and father, and perhaps with good reason. We may have parents who have not treated us well, and that may not just be a feeling like that normal teenage angst we have of oh, my parents gave me a curfew and it's so unfair. But some of us have experienced real hurt and wounds from our moms and our dads. So when we hear a commandment like honor your father and your mother, or we read or hear in Sirach today, hey, honor and revere your parents, obey their authority because God gives them that authority, we can sort of pull back a little bit and say, yeah, but you don't know my parents, and I would if they were good, but they're not, so I can't. I think we have to reverse a little bit about what it means to honor them. And sometimes we've been hurt. And in this passage, I think a key piece is to say honor is willing what is good for them, which is ultimately heaven. That doesn't mean forgiving every mistake and then forgetting it. It doesn't mean saying, well, the past is in the past. It doesn't mean that our hurts or our wounds are irrelevant. What it does mean is that at the most basic level, we have to say, at least I can pray for my parents that they would find healing and that they one day too could be gathered into God's heavenly kingdom. And if I can honor them in that way, I've started and I've actually gone a long way to fulfilling that commandment. Now, for the rest of us who maybe have, if we really step back and think, I've got pretty good parents, I had pretty good parents, I didn't like their boombox gift, but I did like it. Honoring them means listening to their rules and respecting their authority. If we still live at home with our parents, for many of us who are watching this as teenagers, that's, we're between the ages of 13 and 18. For some of us who are 35 and watching this and you're still at home with your parents, keep striving and hustling. But at the end of the day, we're in their house and we have to be obedient to their rules and their authority. But honoring our parents means listening to those things. So what do we owe to our parents? We owe them our respect, and we owe them an obedience to their authority insofar as those people are making good rules that are ultimately willed towards our good, even if we don't disagree with them. Probably say, yeah, at the end of the day, I get it. Our second reading is coming from St. Paul, and he is writing to the Colossians. And St. Paul, again, is talking about how we treat one another. How do we Serve one another. He says, brothers and sisters, put on as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, heartfelt, compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience, bearing with one another and forgiving with one another. And he is again talking about what does it mean? What do we owe to one another as a community, as a family of faith? We owe that we would be patient, that we be kind, that we be gentle, that we would be humble with one another. And that's how we live in right relationship. Now, St. Paul goes a little bit deeper in this reading, and it's part of a longer version of the reading that you may or may not hear in church. Many of you might not, because the next part of the reading can be a little bit challenging without some context. But we're going to dive into it because you might hear the longer reading and you might be wondering, what an interesting thing to say, St. Paul. Tell me more about that. And here's the longer part of the reading you might not hear. And as soon as I start speaking, you're going to say, oh, I think I get why maybe Father's chosen not to read that whole thing. He says, wives, be subordinate to your husbands, as is proper in the Lord. Husbands, love your wives and avoid any bitterness toward them. Children, obey your parents in everything, for this is pleasing to the Lord. Fathers, do not provoke your children so that they may not become discouraged. And that's the end of the reading. That's the longer version. And it's really appropriate on the Feast of the Holy Family because it talks about what do we owe to one another as a family. But it has some challenging language in it that needs a little bit of context. In a different letter, St. Paul is writing to this group in Ephesus, the Ephesians, and he's talking about what a husband and wife owe to each other. And what he's talking about is mutual submission. And what happens, ideally in a marriage, is this beautiful exchange where both people take on this attitude that Christ has of submitting to another and submitting for the good of another towards each other. So there's trust involved in letting go of myself for the good of another person and trusting that that other person actually is letting go of the good of themselves for me. Now, this doesn't mean we're self-destructive or we stay in bad relationships or we allow people to do things that harm us. If somebody's not willing our good, we have to make sure that we're protected. But in the ideal marriage, in the ideal family, people are looking out for the good of one another. And that's what St. Paul is getting at. He's presenting this ideal and he's saying, if you want to strive for good things, husbands, love your wives, wives, love your husbands. And we get this further context in this reading from Ephesians. St. Paul's echoing that same teaching here to the Colossians. He's looking at husbands and wives and saying, you need to love one another, submit to one another, be kind to one another, be gentle with one another, because that is what you owe to one another in marriage, that you would give of yourself for the good of that other person. It's this beautiful moment where we let go and where we are able to also receive. He then talks about the relationships parents have with children. Parents, honor your children. Don't provoke them to anger. Don't be cruel to them. And children, obey your parents. Again, it's that letting go of something and trusting that another person has the good will for us. So what do we owe to one another? And St. Paul dives into that in Colossians. Finally, our gospel comes from the Gospel of Matthew. And Matthew is focusing a little bit more on Joseph's perspective on the nativity. So Joseph is now needing to take charge and lead his family out of harm's way. And they are fleeing into Egypt. Now, this is an important note that Matthew makes because he really is writing towards a mostly Jewish audience and he wants to connect the journey of Jesus to the journey of the Israelite people as they fled out of Egypt. And there was this flight out of Egypt and this flight away from oppression. And that is what Joseph is doing with Jesus and with Mary. And what is owed by Joseph to his family? To protect them. That's why God put Joseph in a position to be a guide and a leader for Mary and Joseph through those early years of their lives as Jesus is formed. And so what is owed to them is his obedience to God in that. And we hear that Joseph hears in a dream he needs to flee, probably less than an ideal situation with a newborn, but he's obedient to God's call, and that is what is owed to his family. So on this, the Feast of the Holy Family, what is owed to your family? Where are you at? Do you need to, if there's been wounds and hurts that you've caused, do you need to go reconcile those things? If those things have been inflicted upon you, do you need to pray for others and find a place for healing? Maybe not total reconciliation, because that might not be the best move, but at least forgiveness. And then if you are in a position where you have siblings, what is owed to them? What does it mean to love one another as Christ loved us? We focus on that in this Christmas season as we meditate on the Holy Family. I hope you enjoy the rest of your 12 days of Christmas, wherever we're at, your Christmas octave. Maybe open up some cool like candies and just celebrate, but enjoy the rest of your week. And we'll see you back next week for my favorite feast day of the year, Epiphany. We'll see you then.